They're advancing slowly, but the cost is massive. Throughout 2024, UK Defence Intelligence has estimated that the Russians have lost between 1,400 and 1,600 soldiers a day. Every day through 2024. They've lost tens of pieces of equipment a day. The Russian storage sites for their armoured vehicles, even going back to T-55s and beyond that, are emptying extremely fast. Vladimir Putin is using his ammunition where he was in the early days of 2022. He had a 6-to-1 ratio of what the Russians could fire to the Ukrainians could respond with. The end of 2022 or the end of 2024, we're now down to 1-to-2, and now they can still respond with more, but they're running out of ammunition.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today we're looking back at 2024 in the war in Ukraine and focusing in particular on the ground war over the past 12 months. Joining me, one of our regular guests here on Frontline, former Colonel Philip Ingram, MBE, former NATO planner and military intelligence officer. It's always a pleasure, Philip. First of all, how would you summarise the ground war in Ukraine over the past 12 months?
From a tactical perspective, I think we're almost in a stalemate position, but it's been fascinating, as it's moved from one side having the initiative back to the other side having initiative, to the initiative been taken back again. But that's purely from a tactical perspective. We have to recognise that the ground war has also been going on in depth, so into Crimea, into Russia, and that is at the operational level and attacking into the strategic level. But it is hitting ground targets, so I'd count that in as part of it, and that's a different matter.
And of course, at the start of the year, something that caused immense frustration for Ukraine was the delay in the big package. I think it was $60 billion worth of military aid from the US. It got held up in Congress. It wasn't eventually approved until I think April, and then most of it wasn't delivered until the summer. In terms of what we've been seeing on the ground, how much of an impact did that have? How much did that undermine the Ukrainian war effort?
It had a massive impact, and we have to go back to before 2024. The Ukrainians launched their long-awaited counteroffensive as we came into the year. We'd got the winter where we were anticipating things easing off, but the counteroffensive hadn't taken the big chunks of territory back in the way that people had expected after their previous taking back, Kherson and Kharkiv in big chunks of territory. And there was a lot of bad press for the Ukrainians and criticism of their ability to fight forward. And then the $60 billion, a lot of that was needed to release simple things like ammunition, artillery ammunition, as well as equipment, as well as more capital support, but release that from US stocks so it could go forward. And we had reports coming through the year of the Ukrainians not having enough shells for their guns, and their guns only been able to fire a few shells a day, whereas the Russians were able to still fire in hundreds, if not thousands a day in different areas. And that had a direct impact on Ukraine's ability to maintain the front line as it was, and allowed Russia to start to regain the initiative in certain areas. And Russian tactics have tweaked through the year. They're learning the lessons of how they're getting things wrong, and they're adapting that. They're adapting it in a way that in modern warfare is horrific, because it costs human life and they don't care about it.
Have we seen any significant shift in the tactics being used by Ukraine? And I'm thinking in particular about when there was a change in the military command, and when General Zaluzhny left, and he's now the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, and when General Syrskyi took over. Did that come with any change in tactics?
Not immediately. And Syrskyi took over. He's spent a lot of his time, and really we didn't see any initiatives coming out of him to start with. And then all of a sudden we had the incursion into Kursk. And that is something that he will have planned with General Budanov, because he's taken his time to try and understand what is wrong on the front line, and how you can then try and dislocate the Russians, regain the initiative, and try and force the Russians to do something different. And of course, Budanov is the head of the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence. He's the one that's been having the success at the operational level and in depth with special operations executive type operations, and that is having a significant impact on the Russians. But the immediate change in command, I think it was right and proper that he spent some time looking at what was going on, because the Ukrainians are, they don't have the optimal force packages for what was tried in the counteroffensive beforehand. They don't have the ability to put a proper armoured formation to punch through the defensive lines that the Russians have got in there. And those defensive lines, you're putting them into context, they're the strongest defensive lines we've seen in any conflict at any time ever. Those are the Suvorikhan lines with the tank traps and the trenches and the minefields and everything else in different layers that's through. And that requires any armoured force that punches into it to be able to dominate the ground in a way that it stops it being interfered by enemy artillery, stops it being interfered by enemy air and aviation. And the difference is aviation is helicopter forces that are there, and then gives you sufficient engineering and armoured engineering capability to punch through those defences so that you can then allow your fighting elements to safely get into the enemy territory, and you spread out and push the enemy away. Ukrainians didn't have the ability to do any of that. And part of that's down to the lack of the resources, the $60 billion that was held up for US domestic political reasons, not for anything else. The lack of the equipment that's in there. The Ukrainians just simply don't have enough armoured engineers to be able to get through what there is there. They're still learning how to fight formation armoured tactics at the sort of level where you'd need to do that. But they didn't have the ability to create the local air superiority bubble. So whenever they tried that beforehand, and we saw the first rush with Western tanks and other armoured vehicles when they first got in, and we lost a number of them in the first few days. And that was down to Russian air and Russian aviation and been able to interdict it. And the Ukrainians had no response to that. So I think it was right and proper that new commander sits back. Syrskyi looks at what it is that has gone wrong and designs deliberately his operations in the future. Part of that and part of the factors that come into that are making sure he's got the wherewithal, the equipment, the training, the integration of the tactics between the different layers to allow him to get that bubble. And that certainly hasn't appeared through 2024.
A lot gets made of the incremental gains that Russia has made in the East. How much significance should we place on them?
I don't think we should place a huge significance on it. I think we should be cognizant of it and keep monitoring it, because any progress is something that is giving Putin an advantage. And when it comes to morale on the battlefield, and therefore the morale that goes up into the Ukrainian people and the level of political resolve that you get, not just inside Ukraine, but then from international support, that is being used to suggest the Russians are winning. They're advancing slowly, but the cost is massive. Throughout 2024, UK Defence Intelligence has estimated that the Russians have lost between 1,400 and 1,600 soldiers a day. Every day through 2024. They've lost tens of pieces of equipment a day. The Russian storage sites for their armoured vehicles, even going back to T-55s and beyond that, are emptying extremely fast. Vladimir Putin is using his ammunition where he was in the early days of 2022. He had a 6-to-1 ratio of what the Russians could fire to the Ukrainians could respond with. The end of 2022 or the end of 2024, we're now down to 1-to-2, and now they can still respond with more, but they're running out of ammunition. That's why he's relying on North Korea to provide it. His defence industrial base can't keep up. Manpower, he's getting North Korea, and he's recruiting heavily in Africa through the rump of his Wagner group that's there. He can't get the manpower to continue to meet that 1,400 to 1,600 deaths and life-changing injuries a day. And we're starting to see other Ukrainian actions, in particular the incursion into Kursk, bring greater visibility of what's going on into the Muscovite type and St. Petersburg type Russian people, where they're gaining a more of an understanding of what's going on. And people are starting to question things. That, combined with sanctions biting and everything else, has effectively got Putin on the back foot. So it's easy for us from a commentary perspective to say Russia is gaining ground on the front line, therefore Russia must be winning. And I liken it back to the Vietnam War. The Americans won every tactical battle that they fought in the Vietnam War. The front line are tactical battles. America didn't win Vietnam, and therefore this conflict is not going to be won on who gains most territory from a tactical perspective. That will influence what happens when the negotiations eventually happen, but it's not going to win or lose the war.
It's a really interesting conversation around the Russian casualty rate, which, as you explained, Philip, is enormous. But to what extent is it sustainable? Because I suppose you could say any casualty rate is sustainable until it isn't.
Yep.
And okay, they're managing to use these North Korean troops, even troops from Africa, and indeed the Middle East. The Yemeni Houthis are now providing troops for the Russians, which is quite something. But could 2025 be the year in which the supplies run out, and maybe there are political risks then for Putin if he has to launch a fresh wave of mobilisation? Yeah,
well, I think we've seen 2024 be the year where he has got sustainability problems, and that's why we're seeing the Houthis in, we're seeing troops from Africa, we're seeing North Korea being used. And Putin has just been embarrassed in the Middle East in support for Syria. Now that'll give him a little bit of manpower, not much whatsoever coming in. We're also hearing stories of other specialist military personnel being used as infantry in the front line. So some Air Force personnel, there's been stories. Now these are unconfirmed, but there's likely to be an element of truth in them. And we're hearing stories from individuals in the front line who they're not getting trained before they're put in, and they're being pushed out into these meat grinder operations where they're just being killed. They're advancing because there's so many of them coming in waves that the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, and therefore have to abandon their positions because the next wave is running over the bodies of those that have been killed by the Ukrainians and just getting into that position. So that's completely unsustainable. I think 2025 is going to be a massive turning point for Putin, and it's where we're going to start seeing the first cracks in the wider political support he's got. The true extent of the impact it's having inside Russia and the true extent of his ability to sustain it is very difficult to calculate at the moment with the reports that are coming out. So I would hope that 2025 will be the point where we start to see the Russian support at the political level, but their military support on the front lines collapse. That will be aided if Ukraine can carry out a number of other different operations like they attempted with Kursk. But how sustainable Putin is and what other support he's going to get from elsewhere is difficult to ascertain. So I think 2025 will, if it doesn't collapse then, will certainly set the conditions for it to collapse. But this is going to go on for a long time yet.
You mentioned Kursk. We can't look back over the past 12 months without mentioning what happened in August with the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. How significant a moment was that? And is it too early to judge it a success?
It was a hugely significant moment, and I think it's not too early to judge it as a success. It was a massive success. And the reason why I'm saying that is, if we look at what was happening then, we got General Syrskyi had come in, he'd taken over. The Russians were still advancing, albeit slowly, but they were still taking some of what again commentators describe as cities or large towns. They aren't. They're little villages.
Yeah.
They're tiny little things, and most of the civilian population have been out of them anyway. And the Russian approach is to destroy everything, meet waves of troops to go through, and the Ukrainians are forced to fall back. But they were achieving that, and I think Syrskyi, as he was doing his review, recognised that by continuing to reinforce this, defending against these meat grinder operations isn't going to dislocate the Russians in any way, shape, or form, and therefore he had to do something different. And I think this had been tested beforehand because we'd seen a couple of small incursions by the Russian Legion, which are the Russian nationals who fight for Ukraine, into Russia, into the Belgorod region of Russia, where they went in for a few days and then came out. That's testing what was going on. That was probably preemptive to this. And then we had the much larger incursion into Kursk, and that dislocated the Russians. The Russians didn't know how to respond to that. The Ukrainians, because of the size of formation they put in, there's only so far that they could go without overstretching themselves. because if they'd gone too far and kept advancing, which they probably could have done, but that have overstretched their supply lines, that would have made it easier for the Russians to interdict that and to get to position to push them out. So they've got to a point where they've put up their defences, they're holding ground. They were hoping it would force the Russians to take troops away from the front line in the east. And this is where the Russians made the right decision. They didn't. They haven't taken them round. They've generated other forces through other means to defend against the Ukrainian advance and now to start to push back against it. But that took them, 5 months?
Yeah.
To do that before we started to see the Russians actually beginning to hold things up. And what it did do from a bigger perspective is it gave the Ukrainians for that period of time the initiative back. They were dictating what was happening, not on the front line in the east, but the Russians were nervous about what was happening there because they're having to reallocate some resources. But what was happening in supporting the front line in the east and what was happening from a political perspective and how the Russian people got to know about what was going on, because other parts of Russia were now under Ukrainian control. And then from an international community, the international community were going, oh, that's a bold move. And there was debate as to whether Zelensky should have been criticised for it because was it legal or was it anything else? It was a very bold, very necessary, the right military move to make. And let Syrskyi, I think, stamp his authority on the design of the battlefield. And it wrestled the initiative back at that operational level, which I think was critical. It hasn't had the effect that he wanted, but then the enemy don't follow your plan. So the Russians won't have read his plan, or they probably did because they're very good at in the intelligence game. But then went, we're not going to do what he says. I think what has happened with the Ukrainians is because since then is because the Russians didn't react to that. What Syrskyi hasn't done or hasn't got the wherewithal to do is to then follow through with something else and something else in relatively quick succession to retain that initiative. So we've seen them go into Kursk, stop, allow the Russians to build up a capability to attack back against them. The Russians have started to do that, and now we've got into that stalemate position again, or maybe the Russians are advancing very slowly from a tactical perspective. I would expect Syrskyi and Budanov to do something else. I was hoping that they would sequence this. That would be phase one of a number of different operations. I'm hoping they will be sequencing this early in 2025 so that they can continue to keep that initiative. They have to regain it again.
And do you think the only reason they haven't is a matter of resources?
I think it probably is down to resources. We keep seeing the Russian casualty figures. We don't see the Ukrainian casualty figures. Zelensky made a statement in the last week or so about casualty figures, and I think they were probably a very low estimate. If the Russians are losing 1,400 a day, the Ukrainians are probably losing 500-600 a day. And it's a much smaller country, and they're not recruiting outside at the same levels that the Russians are. And we're in a game of sustainability. Logistics will, and as part of that logistics, the defence industrial base that's supporting everything will win or lose this conflict. And part of that is the sustainability of manpower. Now, the Ukrainians are very reluctant to reduce their recruiting age down to 18 because they want to keep their younger adult men in a position where you can sustain the population of the country, and they're very reluctant to go down to that, but they may have to. They're in a war of national survival. But I think what we fail to recognise in the West and a lot of the political commentary that's coming out, they're not just in a war of national survival. They're fighting a war for us when it comes to European and international survival.
And of course, the geopolitics is going to dominate in 2025 with the return of Donald Trump and speculation about possible peace talks. If you park that to one side, which is a big thing to park, but if you just park it for one moment, if we assume that the ground war continues, what do you think we may see over the next 12 months?
Well, I think it's a fair assumption that the ground war will continue, no matter what we've heard from Donald Trump. And it's interesting. We might get into that, but we're going to see more of the same until one side or other takes that initiative back again. Now, the Russians are adapting their tactics. They're adapting their tactics in the front line. They've brought in their meat grinder tactics. They've changed the way their squads fight because they've run out of equipment. They're running out of experienced troops, experienced commanders. And we're seeing adaptations in the way they deal with things, and they're overwhelming the Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainians are adapting their defenses, but we have to recognize the massive size of the front line that they're trying to defend against. This is the equivalent of Aberdeen to London. If we were putting it in UK terms, that's massive. That is very, very difficult for any military to be able to defend against, because if you're being attacked at all different levels, you're spread very thinly. So we're likely to see in that eastern part no massive changes, I think, in the front lines, until I suspect we will see the Ukrainians planning potentially some form of armoured formation maneuver, midsummer-ish, against the Russians. But that will only happen if they get additional armoured engineering resources and they get additional air power that's in. And this is the infamous F-16s that started to come in through 2024. But the need to have sufficient capability to be able to properly push the Russian Air Force and aviation forces back, and to provide that tactical support to troops on the ground so that they can get through the defences in a way that they're not being destroyed on the defences by the Russians in direct and indirect fire against them, which is how defences should be. Whether they're going to have the wherewithal in 2025 to do that or not, I don't know. I suspect what we'll see through 2025 again are more daring operations like Kursk from Syrskyi and Budanov to try and dislocate the Russians again, whether we'll see just one as we have with Kursk, or whether we'll see several and have them properly linked. I would hope there would be several and have them linked. I suspect that the Ukrainians will have only the ability to do one again, and they'll choose their time and space to try and dislocate Putin, and that will be linked to what's going on geopolitically.
Well, just finally on the geopolitics, obviously we've been focusing mainly today on the ground war, but let's talk about the geopolitics just to finish. Let me put a scenario to you, Philip, and see if you buy it. I think there is a chance that in the new year, Donald Trump takes office, he tries to pressure Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table, but Putin will not feel in a position to acquiesce to the demands that Trump is making. Mm-hmm. Trump will be very conscious of the fact he doesn't want a repeat of Joe Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yep. He doesn't want something equivalent happening on his watch. And he will also be conscious of the fact that Vladimir Putin has been weakened by recent events in Syria. Mm-hmm. And he will be sensitive to the charge that he is somehow Putin's lapdog. Mm-hmm. And so he may react angrily to Putin refusing to come to the negotiating table, and as a result ramp up arms for Ukraine. Do you think that's viable?
I think that's very viable. I think that if you had to ask me what was probable, I'd say that's probable. And if you look at what's going on at the moment in the diplomatic manoeuvring before Trump takes over on the 20th of January, the conditions are being set for that. Trump has talked to Putin and talked to Zelensky. Zelensky's response is to come up with a plan, to go to Trump at his Mar-a-Lago estate and present that plan to him and go through it. And as part of that plan, it's come out in the negotiation, in the reporting of it, he said, I'd be willing to give up some of the territory temporarily if it stops the fighting, so that I can then get that back diplomatically in the future. And therefore he is being Mr. Cooperative when it comes to Trump's idea of there being a negotiated settlement. Putin, when the phone call went in between Trump and Putin's team, through Peskov, denied, and that's his spokesman, denied that a phone call had ever happened. And then immediately after that, we started to see across Russian national television naked pictures of Melania Trump plastered everywhere. We have to look at Putin's psyche. Putin's psyche is an old intelligence officer. That broadcast across Russian national television of Donald Trump's wife was him threatening him and turning around and saying, from a petulant perspective, I didn't like our conversation. It didn't go the way I expected it to go, and now I'm going to threaten you. Trump's not going to listen to that. He's going to respond really quite angrily to that. And I think we're going to see a ramping up of his rhetoric in trying to push Putin, and especially as he will see that Putin is now on the back foot when it comes to what's happened through Syria and elsewhere, and he'll see that putting pressure on him as the ability to put pressure on Iran, the ability to put pressure on China and elsewhere, because he knows how much China will have invested, and Trump and China don't work well together. So whilst Trump's got the diplomatic and the geopolitical initiative on this, I don't think he's going to let it go. Meanwhile, we've got Zelensky turning around saying, I'm willing to, I'll do what you're suggesting and everything else. And Trump will then have to turn around, I think, and say, okay, you're being cooperative, you're not being cooperative, I need to teach you a lesson. The safest way to do that without putting American lives at risk is to give you additional resources. And it wouldn't surprise me if Trump gives him a huge package to really hurt Vladimir Putin in some way. Trump may tie that in, and here's where I'm speculating a little bit, into further pressure on NATO or on European nations.
Your investment.
And get them to get Europe to up its investment. And that may turn around, and here's where I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit, into him suggesting that European nations physically put troops into the western part of Ukraine to free up Ukrainian troops that are protecting against the Belarus border and elsewhere, so that they can go forward to the east and then impose over that part of Ukraine a no-fly zone. Because I don't think Putin would have the ability to respond to that. And that would force the West to then start to look at its defense expenditure and elsewhere. And Trump's already making noises about NATO nations that aren't contributing their 2%. And I wouldn't surprise me if he ups that 2% to 2.5% or 3% as a requirement, because that's still less than the Americans are putting into their defense budget. And again, Trump will be cognizant of there are three major conflicts around the world that are brewing. We've got Europe with Russia, Ukraine, we've got the Middle East, and we don't know where that's going to go. And we've got a brewing threat down in Southeast Asia with China's expansionism and things around Taiwan. And that's America's back door. That's where their primary focus is. They don't want to be taking on, from a world policeman's perspective, all three. And therefore, I think that Trump will force Europe to step up and take a greater lead on one of them, and the one is Russia-Ukraine.
We tend to think Russia's doing really well, but the economy is struggling a great deal now. Recently, I think it was this week, in the last few days, President Putin has increased the defense spending by 25%. It's now virtually a third of their total spending. That is not sustainable. And they're also, as we've seen, the events in Syria, in Georgia, there are other areas where Moscow needs to exert influence. And the longer the fight goes on in Ukraine, the longer the risks are to Russia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're looking back at the war in Ukraine during 2024, and in particular focusing on the sea and air war. And joining me to discuss that, delighted to be joined by one of our regular guests here on Frontline, Sean Bell, former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast. Sean, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Thank you, James. Good to be here.
Let's begin with the air war in 2024 in particular. And let's start by looking at the use of drone warfare. I mean, we have seen throughout this conflict the innovations on both sides of drone warfare. It is worth remembering this is now the largest drone war in history. Have we seen further innovation still over the course of the last 12 months?
Yeah, absolutely, James. I mean, it has been phenomenal. And I think it's also changed what our view is, what drones are. I think many of us would have thought of drones as these little handheld devices that go buzzing around, take a few pictures, that you get as Christmas presents. And of course, what's happened is that there's a whole range now, not only those small ones that are very, very good at not being seen, provide eyes and ears over the battlefield, but also we've seen the long range drones, particularly. I think there's been a lot of talk by the end of the year about long-range missiles. We'll get onto that, I'm sure. But the Ukrainians have been very, very effective at building their own long-range drones, which might not go that fast, but they go a long way, and they are having a massive effect on the battlefield. I think particularly what I've been very impressed by, and I think will have profound implications for our own defence review, is just the rate at which these can be innovated. In the military, when I was part of the military machine, you devise a requirement, but it would often be 10 years before you saw that capability actually in service. And of course, a lot of the times, therefore, technology had far outpaced your ability to stay on top of it. What we're seeing this year is just a whole range of new drones coming in because, you invent one drone that goes across, drops a hand grenade on the enemy. The enemy, therefore, creates a jamming mechanism for it. Therefore, the Ukrainians now develop a new way of targeting, whether it be through optical tracking or whether it be through terrain mapping that doesn't rely on the GPS signals. And it's just this war, counter war. You've seen those cages over the top of the Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers. They look really weird, but they are specifically designed because of the major threat of drone warfare. And of course, finally, President Zelensky famously said that he wanted to get his defense industrial base to deliver 1 million of these drones every year. And that's a massive number. And it probably goes all the way from the small ones to the big ones, probably with help from the international community. But it probably explains as well why they've taken such a big role in this war, and also why Russia has felt compelled to attack the energy infrastructure and Ukraine's defense industrial base, because it recognizes just the power and the influence that these drones are having on the battlefield.
It's a really good point you raise in terms of how Russia's been using it to obviously strike, as you say, Ukrainian energy infrastructure and towns and cities as well. But of course, Ukraine has been doing the same, and they've also been using drones to go after Russian energy infrastructure. How would you kind of compare the damage that either side have inflicted on each other using drones?
I think, it's a really good question, actually, because I think Russia has had the full spectrum of weapons available to it, long range, short range, ballistic missiles, the like. And it knows where all of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is. I mean, let's face it, it was part of the former Soviet Union. Most of this stuff is not new, and therefore they know exactly where it is. And therefore Russia has been able to strike across the whole country. Ukraine, Russia is a massive country. Ukraine won't necessarily know where all the energy infrastructure is. And besides, it will be incredibly difficult for Ukraine to take out all of Russia's energy infrastructure. Besides, given the limited number of ordnance that Ukraine has, would I, as a military guy, suggest they went after that? Almost certainly not. There are much more juicy targets that Ukraine would want to take out. I think what we have seen over the last year particularly is that Ukraine has wanted to make sure that normal Russians recognize they're in a war. And therefore, it's been less about having decisive impacts on infrastructure and more about making sure that Russians recognize that they are not immune to the effects of this war. And I think the other angle, which Ukraine has tried very effectively to do, is recognize that Russia is funding this war largely through the sale of its oil and gas. And therefore, if you can target the facilities that produce, refine or export those raw materials, then actually you can have a material impact on Russia's ability to finance the war. And that's where they've been very successful.
And Sean, on the topic of sort of Ukrainian strikes against Russia, away from striking energy depots, we've also seen them go after Russian airfields as well, and they have had some success there.
Yeah, they have, James. I mean, it is interesting that Ukraine have tried to get the Russians on the back foot by not being predictable about what they're going to strike. And as you know, airfields generally are fairly well protected. You generally put aircraft in hardened aircraft shelters, and the sort of weapons that Ukraine has aren't going to be effective. But Russia was a bit complacent. They had left some of their aircraft out in the open, and by all accounts, that Ukraine was quite successful at striking them. But you have to look at this in context. We're talking about ones and twos. We're not talking about double figures. And Russia has huge amounts of aircraft. I think the bigger impact was that when the West had decided to give long-range weapons, we fairly swiftly saw Russia move most of its jets beyond the range of those missiles to keep them in safety. Does that impact the war? Not really. It does mean it's more difficult for them to plan missions because the Russians have got to go a lot further there and back. But frankly, if you're short of weapons, I suspect that's an area where Ukraine will probably have higher priority targets.
Spot on. Lovely stuff. Yeah, that's a really good point. We have seen over the course of 2024 the ruble becoming increasingly weak, and particularly, of course, in the summer, in the wake of the Kursk incursion, but also towards the end of the year as well. Let's come on to the long-range missiles, Sean, because this was one of the biggest stories of the war in 2024, whether Ukraine should be allowed to use Western-supplied long-range missiles, such as the US-supplied ATACMS, the British Storm Shadows, the French Scout missiles, inside Russian territory. And it wasn't until November that President Biden changed his tack and essentially approved their use, although even then with limits only inside Kursk Oblast. Had that decision come much earlier, as Ukraine wanted, had it come far earlier in 2024, what impact could that have had on the war?
Yeah, this is a question that gets asked pretty regularly. I'm not sure that it would have had a significant impact on the war. It is worth pointing out that the slight irony of all of this, that when the West has provided bullets or anti-tank weapons or rockets or artillery shells, we haven't said they couldn't be used to fire across the border. And yet, for some reason, we decided that a weapon that could travel 100 miles was, well, that's too far, but 20 miles from an artillery shell is okay. And lots of this was frankly due to President Putin saber rattling, particularly around the nuclear threat, and intimidating the West, largely because Putin knew full well that if the West was to get involved in this conflict, that Russia's ambitions would be thwarted in a heartbeat. So it became a bit of an issue which it never really should have been. The UK, my understanding is, when they first gave Storm Shadow to President Zelensky, was as long as you use them in accordance with the law of armed conflict, you use them however you need to. It was only subsequently that America got a bit more concerned about as effectively, Russia had been invaded by Ukraine to the Kursk region, and all of a sudden that might risk an escalation, and said we ought to be more coherent. So it said to the UK, I think you need to rescind that until we're happy as an organisation to provide weapons that are long range. And it became a real issue. But the fact remains is that, first of all, Storm Shadow, they're not available in very large quantities. The Ukrainians have had them for over a year now. We only had, I think, about 500 or 600 available from stocks to give them. I'd be very surprised if there's many left now. ATACMS is a newer form of missile, but that's over $1 million a shot. There's not that many. They can't produce a lot of them. So I honestly don't think it was going to make a great deal of difference. But politically, it made a huge difference and made a real opportunity for President Putin to demonstrate that he has a lot of influence over the West, rather than actually the West just standing firm. Bullies generally respect strength. They don't. They exploit weakness. And we've seen evidence that Putin has exploited that weakness. So I think it's not about the military impact of those weapons. It's actually far more about the political impact.
With the benefit of hindsight, should the Ukrainians not have done what they did with the incursion into Kursk, which we assume had no prior approval from the White House, and actually followed the old adage of it's better to seek forgiveness than to ask permission? They had these weapons, they had these long-range missiles to begin with. Had they just decided, you know what, we're going to take a risk, we're going to fire them into Russian territory, it is unlikely that the Americans or the Europeans would come down on them like a ton of bricks. I mean, at the end of the day, they are supportive of Ukraine. Would that not have, in hindsight, have been better, or would that have been escalatory, and would that have risked alienating the Biden administration?
I think it's an interesting question, but I would phrase it slightly differently. Every step of the way, so at the start of the war, bluntly, I don't think the West expected Ukraine to survive. We provided anti-tank weapons and some defensive weapons. We were very clear to call them defensive weapons. But gradually, since the start of the war, we agreed to provide tanks. You'll remember the then Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, agreeing to provide Challenger 2. There weren't many, but he was trying to open the door for other nations to do so. Likewise, then it became long-range weapons. Then it became F-16s. If at any stage along that path, Ukrainians had betrayed the deal, betrayed the arrangement under which those weapons would have been given, I think almost certainly that would have eroded international support for going a further step. And I think history books will be written around this conflict that say, if only the West would have been confident right at the start, to actually give Ukraine the weapons on day one, give F-16s, give long-range missiles, give tanks. That's a much more interesting question about whether the outcome would have been changed. But I personally think it would have been folly for President Zelensky to ignore the West's limitations, because that would close the door to future opportunities. And I think, if you look now where we are today, have we reached the end of the road? No. If the West genuinely wanted to stop Russia, in putting a no-fly zone in place would do it in pretty much in a heartbeat. I mean, President Zelensky has been trying to fight a war without air cover. You only have to look back in history. Incredibly difficult to do that. Whereas if air power was to put it in place, so he will still be harboring the hope that the West might, if, for example, if in the new year President Trump decides to withdraw aid, if the Europeans decide to try and step up to the plate and make sure that Ukraine doesn't fall, all of that trust and faith in how Ukraine uses the weapons, I think, will all form part of that European decision. So it's a long way of saying it, but I think Zelensky was absolutely right not to chance his arm.
And of course, it was in response to the approval of the ATACMS in November that we then learned about Russia's development of a new intermediate range ballistic missile called Oreshnik. How significant is that? And is that really a sign of the escalation of missile warfare that clearly the Americans were worried about?
I think what's fascinating about the Oreshnik is that, it's not a new capability. It's new to be used in Ukraine. And yes, it's a modification of an old missile. But, I'm an old fart now, and, I've been around a long time. And even in the early days of my career, both America and Russia had missiles capable of going all the way around the world. They were hypersonic because they went into the above the Earth's atmosphere in order to travel the long distances. So the ability to fire big rockets out, make them go very fast, and then drop down with several warheads has been around for decades. What happened here was that President Putin recognized that this escalation, in his words, of being allowed to use long-range weapons, he wanted to demonstrate to the West that I've got you in my sights. And by firing a weapon, which Oreshnik had a range of about 3,000 miles, if you draw those rings on, it includes all of Europe. And of course, that's exactly what Russia wanted to hear. He wanted the whole of Europe to go, oh dear, we're within range. We've been within range of Russia for decades. And the irony of all of this, frankly, James, is that it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. It was Russia that's been using long-range weapons to target the whole country of Ukraine. It has bought weapons from North Korea in order to target Ukraine. It's done them from Iran. It's used dual-use technology from China. And then it turns around and says, well, if Ukraine has long-range weapons, that's an escalation. It's just preposterous. And so all of this is a similar pattern of Putin simply trying to stop the West getting involved so that he can achieve his objectives before the West wakes up to the fact that we've actually not only acquiesced to Putin, but also we've demonstrated weakness to not only Russia, but a whole lot of other countries around the world.
How would you say Russian and Ukrainian air defences have fared in 2024? Let's do it one at a time. So Ukrainian defences have fared phenomenally well. The trick here is that we hear a lot about the Patriot and missile systems, but of course they are really only focused on the high-end threat, because the most difficult threat to shoot down is the ballistic missile threat, mainly because when it's outside the atmosphere, travelling at Mach 10, 10 times the speed of sound, really, really difficult to shoot something down that's travelling 4 times the speed of a bullet. But of course, when it comes back into the Earth's atmosphere or in its terminal phase, it slows down dramatically. It also gets very hot, and therefore it's a lot easier. I'm not saying it's easier, but a lot easier to shoot down. Now, luckily, those missiles cost a lot of money, but Patriot costs a lot of money, and therefore you've got this sort of high end, and you've got to preserve your Patriots for those high end targets. Luckily, the West has provided a whole lot of other layered air defense. And of course, the Ukrainians, I understand, are using their fighter jets largely to shoot down cruise missiles and, of course, the drones, the drones, the Shahed 136 that they got from Iran. And then they've been producing
under license. Now, do some of these get through? Yes, of course they do. But I visited Ukraine just a little over a month ago, and I spent some time in Kyiv and first of all, I was surprised how few buildings had been struck. Secondly, when you actually went, and I was a weapons instructor on the fighter force at the time, and you looked at the weapons effect and what happened, most of the damage had been done not by a missile, but by the debris of a missile that had been shot down. But of course, the remnants of it had then fallen down into a building. So it wasn't necessarily the Russians successfully targeting something, it was the debris falling. So now, have some of the Russian missiles got through? Yes. Have they targeted energy infrastructure? Yes. Largely because Ukraine is such a big country that positioning these key air defense systems around everything is virtually impossible. But actually, if you look around Kyiv, particularly the center of power, they've done spectacularly well. In terms of Russia, again, it's a really big country. And if I was the head of the Russian military, I would not know where Ukraine was going to strike next. And therefore, they have been very successful at shooting down Ukrainian drones. But again, what's happened is if you've got an air defense system that can shoot down 40 drones at a time, if you put 41 drones against it, one will get through. And this is where quantity has a quality all of its own sometimes. And I think that's why we've seen Ukraine regularly fly a lot of drones against an individual target, swamping the defences. So the Russian defences are very good, but they just don't have enough missiles available at that one moment. And therefore, those tactics mean that Ukraine have been very effective.
It was interesting that earlier this year, when Iran launched a missile strike on Israel, a lot was made of the success of Israel's so-called Iron Dome. And a lot of people are saying, well, hang on, why can't Ukraine have something similar? Is that a fair point, or are there logistical problems? Is it just never going to be realistic that Ukraine would have an Israeli-style air defense system, an Iron Dome, in that manner?
Yeah, again, a great question. I think, first of all, there's one of which is the understanding. We have to be quite clear. The Iron Dome is a system, a short-range defensive system that's specifically designed to shoot down unguided rockets. It comprises a missile system and a radar because the threats from Hamas and from Hezbollah were unguided rockets. They would fire 100 of them at a time. What the radar would work out, the Iron Dome system, is which of these are going to hit a built-up area. Those are the targets. Which of these unguided rockets is not? We'll just leave them. They can land wherever they want to. And therefore, it's a very effective way of defending. And of course, Israel, as you know, is a much smaller country. And if you know specifically where these threats are coming from, you don't need many Iron Dome systems in order to provide protection. Now, that Iron Dome system is not very effective against ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. As a result, the Israelis needed layered air defense. You'll remember earlier on in the year that the West provided a lot of fighter jets because the fighter jets were very good at shooting down drones at a distance, but also the cruise missiles. The one thing they couldn't target was the ballistic missiles, and that was why you needed the Patriot system. And for the second round of those attacks later in the year, you had the US put the THAAD system in place, largely because they knew that if Iran launched a heavy wave, that Patriot wouldn't be able to cope with it. You now transfer that across to Ukraine, which is a much bigger country. First of all, the Iron Dome system for shooting down unguided rockets, that is not the threat to Ukraine at all. The threat to Ukraine is drones, it's cruise missiles, it's bombs, and it's ballistic missiles. And therefore, where would you put this Iron Dome system? What would its target be? That is not what you need in Ukraine. You need a layered air defense system which has the high-end stuff covered by Patriot, the medium range and the cruise missiles covered by a range of other effectors, and then you can use people lying on their backs with machine guns to take out drones if you need to. Shahed only flies 140 miles an hour. They're quite big. They're not difficult to shoot down, but it's just there's a volume of them, and that's the challenge there.
Let's talk briefly, Sean, about the F-16s, because at the start of the year, one of the big debates was, well, when will the F-16s actually be delivered? When will they be deployed by Ukraine? And there was all kinds of speculation as to whether this could be a game-changing weapon. Of course, it was in the summer that they first really started deploying them. But there is an issue around, well, how many do they have? And also, do they have the pilots who are fully trained in order to operate them? How would you assess their impact in the war this year?
Very, very little. At the time this was all being discussed, somebody who's been through the whole flying training system recognised that this wasn't about the aircraft. There are several nations, the Dutch, the Danes, who are retiring F-16s that would make available previously loved F-16s to Ukraine. But even at the time, if you put 100 on the lawn of President Zelensky, that doesn't matter. You need to have people who can operate them, not just fly them, but operate them. Otherwise, they just become a liability. And of course, it was never expected they would actually be involved in the war. It was all because when the war ends, the aim was that Zelensky would need to have a way of developing his own air power and not based on former Soviet Union equipment. But President Zelensky made the case clearly, and the West said, okay, if you want the jets, but you need to develop your pilot training. And since then, there's been a whole raft of initiatives to try and get some of the pilots through. Some of the MiG-29 pilots that now fly F-16s. The trouble is, if you stop them flying MiG-29 to go through a course, they're not available to fly against the Russians for that time. So, you ideally you want what they call ab initios, new pilots going through, but they'll take years to become qualified. The compromise was, my understanding is, they ended up having a half a dozen F-16s operating. My understanding is one of those has been shot down already. My understanding is that was shot down by Ukraine's own air defences. And it just illustrates how difficult it is to operate these aircraft in a wartime environment unless you've got a very, very comprehensive capability. How are they being used? My understanding is that they're shooting down cruise missiles and drones. They don't want to be anywhere near the front line because the front line is dominated by the Russians. The Russians have control of the air. The Ukrainians do not. What they do have is this sort of seed corn of F-16s, which allows them to do short, sharp stabs. But I think President Zelensky thought they'd be the answer to the Maiden's Prayer. He wasn't listening to the folks like us who said there's a bit more to it than that. The West said, okay, here they are. And they're not making a huge difference, is my understanding at the moment.
Let's just turn to naval warfare briefly. I mean, the Black Sea Fleet, of course, has been severely degraded by Ukraine, really remarkably, over the course of the war so far. Has 2024 been quieter, though, on that front, in part because, as we entered the year, the Black Sea Fleet already had been severely degraded?
Yes, I think it's been quieter for a number of reasons. First of which is that the Russians, you have to cast your mind back over a year now, that there were concerns near the start of the war that Russia would do an amphibious assault against Odessa. In other words, bypass a lot of the land defences and just go straight in there. And that was a real concern for the West. But inevitably, because it's been so difficult for the Russian Navy to maintain a presence, because they're not fighting conventional enemy. Ukraine doesn't have a navy, but it's proven very effective at terrorizing the Russian Navy and forced it to hide basically well out of the way in the eastern side of the Black Sea. As a result, but the other complication here is that, again, at the start of this year, last year it was all about Ukraine being on the front foot, spring offensive. Could this be the end of the war? This year has all been about Russia being on the front foot. And at the start of the year, the Ukrainians were still looking at, could we take Crimea? Could we isolate Crimea by severing the Kerch road bridge, which is the main logistics hub to Russia? And that was a maritime challenge to preserve that. As we rolled forward through the year and the Russians made advances, so the land bridge, in other words, going through the Donbass, past Zaporizhia, and then down through the land bridge down to Crimea, that's largely been secured by the Russians now. So they're less reliant on that bridge. And as a result of that, the Russians have felt less of a need to be dominant at sea. And I suspect that's why, for a whole raft of reasons. And you'll know that because of an old agreement, the Turks will not allow warships in and out through the straits into the Black Sea whilst there's a war going on. So Russia has what it has in the Black Sea. It's lost a fair bit of stuff. It doesn't want to lose any more. And quite frankly, it might as well keep out of the way because it's not having a significant impact on the war anymore.
And just finally, Sean, zooming out a bit and looking at the war in the round over the course of the past 12 months, how do you reflect on 2024?
I think The year ended with a degree, last year, with a degree of disappointment that despite the West digging deep into its pockets, not just financially, but also militarily, that the front lines didn't really change. If you look at this year, Russia has its defense industrial base has spun up. It's done more deals with Iran, North Korea. We're seeing not only weapons, but also troops arriving. And despite taking horrendous casualties, I mean, Bakhmut was a battle last year, which the Russians, I think there was about 800 casualties a day, and was described as the bloodiest battle since World War II. In the month of October, apparently they were up at 1,500 casualties a day. It's just obscene levels of casualties, which Russia can't sustain. But it has been bringing in troops from all over the place. And of course, Ukraine cannot afford to get locked into that battle of attrition. It is a smaller army. It's a battle it would lose. And I think over the last year, we've seen almost Ukraine run out of ideas. The West has just not been able to step up to the plate and provide extra weapons, innovative weapons, game-changing weapons. It's almost felt as if the West is doing enough for Ukraine to survive, but not enough to prevail. And that sort of resonates with what President Putin's been doing. I think as a result, we head into the end of the year things are looking relatively bleak for Ukraine. The one positive I would say is that we tend to think Russia's doing really well, but the economy is struggling a great deal now. Recently, I think it was this week, in the last few days, President Putin has increased the defense spending by 25%. It's now virtually a third of their total spending. That is not sustainable. And they're also, as we've seen, the events in Syria, in Georgia, there are other areas where Moscow needs to exert influence. And the longer the fight goes on in Ukraine, the longer the risks are to Russia. So it does feel, with President Trump's inauguration in the 20th of January, you go back to the start of the year, I didn't think Ukraine would be remotely interested in negotiating. Now we've heard Zelensky hint at it. We've heard the British government hint at it. And President Trump is clearly, that's his focus. And it feels like that's the direction of travel. My final line on that, though, is that saddens me in a way, not because of Ukraine, but that we, the West, had the ability to stop Russia. We should have stopped Russia at day one. The Budapest Memo of 1994, we guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty in return for them giving up nuclear weapons. When the time came for that pledge to be called in, we didn't step up to the plate. And as a result, it's quite likely that Putin will end up gaining, I wouldn't say winning, but gaining from his adventures. What message do you think that sends for him in the future, for Iran, for North Korea and for China? This will have profound implications for our global security.
Sean, thank you as ever for your insights and expertise, and I'm sure we'll speak again in 2025.
What the Russians are doing is accepting even higher casualties than usual, and certainly the last few months have been record casualty levels, simply just to sort of, in that last rush, to try and ensure that come January, the front line is the most advantageous it can be for them. I don't think they can sustain this level, but I don't think they necessarily plan to sustain this level.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're looking back at 2024 and asking what kind of year it's been for Vladimir Putin. Joining me to discuss that, delighted to be joined by Mark Galliotti, Honorary Professor at University College London. He's a highly respected expert in Russian politics and global crime and is the author of books including Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine, and co-author of the recent book Downfall, Prigozhin, Putin and the New Fight for the Future of Russia. Mark, always a pleasure. Welcome back. First of all, if you had to summarise the year for Vladimir Putin, how would you do it?
I mean, to be honest, I think he's probably leaving it fairly cocky, despite his reversal in Syria. But from his point of view, this is not a man who necessarily thinks very far ahead, and it's certainly not a man who seems to have a problem with burning through Russia's future in the name of advances today. And so, he goes into 2025 with his forces continuing to advance in the Donbass and the Kursk regions, with the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency that, even if he's not sort of that necessarily sort of providing Russia with what it wants, he is the disruptor in chief. So we can imagine all kinds of shenanigans in the West. A lot of European countries are in crisis. Germany heading towards elections. French President Macron undermined by his trouble sort of holding on to a prime minister. Put all that lot together. And although absolutely there are storm clouds gathering, he's not really one to look for them. So I think he feels probably fairly positive.
Let's look at some of the challenges he's faced, though, in 2024. And much has been made throughout the war in Ukraine of the very high Russian casualty rate. And so far, he appears to be getting away with it. But he is increasingly reliant on foreign troops from Africa, from the Middle East, and also now from North Korea. Long term, as we look into 2025, how big an issue is the manpower challenge for Putin?
I mean, it's a serious challenge. We shouldn't overplay the role of foreign troops. I mean, even if you think of the largest contingent, maybe 10,000 North Koreans. I mean, that's at the current casualty rate. That's what 5-6 days worth of fighting. So, in the grand scheme of things, it is not a big deal. Yes, the manpower issue is, of course, important, but 2 points need to be made. First of all, in some ways, it's even worse for the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainian population is shrunk now down to maybe 31 million or so, compared with more than 140 million Russians. And in this sense, in some ways, Putin can afford to, shall we say, burn through his manpower, however awful that is, thinking of it as human ammunition at a higher rate. But also, at the moment, they're basically losing 2 soldiers for every 1 that they can recruit. But in part, that is likely to be the result of a specific tactical decision. That knowing that the Trump presidency was looming and that Trump, if he actually does follow through with his claim that he's going to basically impose at the very least a ceasefire quickly. So I think what the Russians are doing is accepting even higher casualties than usual, and certainly the last few months have been record casualty levels, simply just to sort of, in that last rush, to try and ensure that come January, the front line is the most advantageous it can be for them. I don't think they can sustain this level, but I don't think they necessarily plan to sustain this level.
If we look at some of the other sort of clouds on the horizon for Vladimir Putin, of course, 2024 was the year the Assad regime fell. That happened earlier this month. And that was seen as a blow not only to Vladimir Putin's prestige, because he had been a great supporter of the Assad regime, but it also raised questions about how quickly autocratic regimes can fall. If you're Vladimir Putin, is that the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night?
I don't think so. I think this is a very specific situation, or at least, again, we have to say we're trying to crawl into the dark recesses of Putin's own brain. I don't think he believes it as such. Let's be honest. I mean, the Russians had for years been warning Assad. They had been warning Assad, firstly, that he needed to reach some kind of an accommodation with at least those elements of the rebel forces which could be bought off, let's say, but also that he had to do something about his army. That his army was massively underpaid, badly led, and so forth. And if you look at the Russians, I mean, at the very least, they are paying their soldiers well. They seem still to have a great deal of morale, and there isn't really any domestic opposition that's left at the moment. So I think they very much see different circumstances. And look, from the point of view of Russia's role in Syria, it was really important in 2015 or so, when Russia was trying to establish that, no, you can't diplomatically isolate us despite our annexation of Crimea and involvement in a sort of undeclared war in the Donbass. Things have moved on. Firstly, Russia has this large stake in Africa, though that may well be very seriously affected by what happens in Syria if they lose the airbase at Khmeimim. But also more broadly, in some ways, Russia is not trying to fight against its pariah status. It has, in a way, embraced it. We are seeing now that the relationship with North Korea, with Iran, with China, and so forth, matters much more than trying to once again get back onto the high table in the West. So, I mean, I think there is a degree to which Syria had, absent the air base and the naval base at Tartus, in some ways already sort of outstayed its value to Moscow.
One of the big events, I suppose, of 2024 when it comes to the war in Ukraine is, of course, the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. Looking back, how much of a setback was that for Russia and for Vladimir Putin? And how much have they learned their lessons potentially from that, if indeed there are lessons to be learned in terms of protecting Russian territory?
Well, to start with the learning the lessons, some things the Russians are able to and have demonstrated their capacity to learn lessons from, others not so much. And I think this falls into the not so much category. There was a lot of talk made about the importance of territorial defence forces, or proper sort of anti-tank defences and all the rest of the stuff along the border. But in some ways, precisely because it's a pretty long border, that northern border between Ukraine and Russia, and it's hard to see any kind of real sustained effort being put into it. So, I mean, I'm not entirely sure if a similar assault was launched in Belgorod region or whatever. I don't think the Russians would necessarily be that ready for it, except in one term. I mean, the Russians did have some forewarning that the Ukrainians were planning something. They just, with great complacency, assumed that it was going to be another one of these very sort of minor little incursions, rush in, take a village, to put it very bluntly, take some selfies and some pictures, and then quickly leave for morale purposes more than anything else. You know, they had basically decided that the Ukrainians wouldn't be launching anything as major as actually happened. So they may well actually be rather less complacent next time. But in terms of the overall impact of it, in some ways, I think that its impact is less than it might have been, because in some ways Putin made the decision to not care. And that was a bit of a gamble at the time, because it was a big deal. It was a large chunk of the Kursk region. It was the first time we'd actually had foreign troops in occupation of Russian territory since the Second World War. That really sort of did matter. There was quite a considerable amount of dismay within the elite and the country as a whole. But actually, by trying to sort of normalize it, by just essentially saying, look, it's no big deal, it's soon going to be dealt with, let's focus on the important stuff. And above all, by not falling prey to the temptation of diverting his battle-hardened veteran troops away from the Donbass front, where they've been continuing to make slow but steady movement, to essentially try and quickly address the Kursk issue. He managed to maintain his military momentum. Now, I think if he is able, and already I think the Russians have taken back about 40% of the salient, if he is able, by the time of a potential ceasefire, to have pretty much pushed the Ukrainians out, then I think he will feel pretty happy with the outcome. That said, look, we have to be clear that there are considerable. Some people are saying up to 50,000 troops being deployed to this operation in the Kursk salient. Now, every soldier that is deployed there, especially if they're not a conscript, is a soldier who otherwise could have been attacking Ukrainian territory. So, it clearly has had an impact. But in hindsight, so much will depend on whether or not we end up with a little bit of Russia actually in Ukrainian hands at a point when in the future, if it happens, there is a fixing of the front line. That will be embarrassing.
Obviously, one of the effects of the Kursk incursion in August was that it did cause the ruble to drop significantly in value. It's recovered a bit, but the ruble remains pretty weak. And looking at the economic challenges that Vladimir Putin faces, is that maybe the thing that should be causing him the most concern at the moment, the underlying weakness of the Russian economy?
Yes, it should. And I think the thing is, I think Putin has an almost kind of Bolshevik approach in a way. Not that he's in any way a communist, quite the opposite. He's in some ways a kind of a nationalist capitalist. But in that sense that ultimately economics can always be shaped by the state. Well, how many British chancellors of the Exchequer would love to have thought that was the case? The fact of the matter is, yes, there are some serious underlying issues with the economy. The ruble's wobbliness is a factor. It certainly sort of leads to inflation. It's not, again, crucial in many ways, because if you look at the key deals, for example, the ammunition that the Russians are getting from the North Koreans, that's actually being handled through swaps largely. It's not being done in money. It's in terms of grain and technology and whatever else. And obviously, the Russian military pays its soldiers in rubles. It pays for its equipment in rubles. So it's not as if this has an immediate impact on its capacity to sort of maintain its war machine. But it is all signs of an economy that is actually heading towards a likely sort of situation of stagflation. So high levels of inflation, but also stagnant productivity. So much of it is geared now for the military sector. The labour market is totally overstretched. I mean, they're basically, it's not just that there aren't more workers available, but the defence sector is sort of vampirically sucking the blood from the rest of the sector. And all of this connects. I mean, it's not just that, for example, the police force is about a quarter under strength, which is leading to higher crime rates, but we've also had news quite recently that RŽD, Russian Railways, is very heavily undermanned at the moment. Fewer staff means you can run fewer trains. Fewer trains mean there's fewer raw materials heading, or finished goods coming out the factories and being taken to where they need. All of these connect. And this is something that Putin really has never understood. He's essentially outsourced economic management to a handful of, admittedly, on the whole, exceedingly capable technocrats, like Central Bank Chair Elvira Nabiullina. But the point is, they do not have any real impact on grand policy. He didn't consult them before invading Ukraine. Their job is just to deal with the fallout. And there is a limit. I mean, they're very good at working out different ways of getting around various crises. But the bottom line is, so long as this war is going on, so long as 40% of all government spending is being devoted to defense and security, then, no matter what kind of fiscal play you feel you have, you can't affect the core things. But the point is, this is leading to stagflation, to a likely long-term slow decline in the Russian economy, not probably the kind of sudden implosion that would have an immediate and dramatic effect on Russia's capacity to wage war.
As we look back over the past 12 months, one of the very significant events that we saw from Vladimir Putin was his change to the Russian nuclear doctrine to essentially lower the threshold for a Russian nuclear strike. How much significance do you place on that, Mark?
Look, we are unlikely to be heading to any kind of scenario in which the Russians are going to be using nuclear weapons. In some ways, this change in nuclear doctrine was a kind of bit of housekeeping, tidying up, to account for an age in which not just drones, but also long-range, high-precision weapons can have almost nuclear-style effects in terms of their capacity to disrupt another country, so they needed to factor that in. And this is a doctrinal change that has been being worked on for years. But also just the way it was presented, it's very much clearly intended to be, shall we say, an information weapon, a psychological operation aimed at the West. Putin has learned that every time he says or even hints at anything that involves nuclear weapons, we sit up and we pay attention, and certain proportions of Western electorates start to get to panic. I mean, I remember when the announcement was made about the change, I got all kinds of messages from different, just people out of the blue saying, oh my God, are we heading toward a nuclear war? And I'd say, no, we are absolutely not. But that's the whole point. He wants people to be scared, because then people, he hopes, will pressurize their governments to say, look, this is spiraling out of control. We need to lower the temperature. And if that means forcing Ukraine to make some kind of ugly peace with Russia, well, so be it, because we want to avoid thermonuclear war. So as I said, I think this is an example of nuclear weapons also as an information weapon, rather than anything that we need to get seriously worried about here and now.
Well, let's talk about the potential for some kind of peace deal in 2025. It is the million-dollar question. How do you see the likelihood at the moment of Vladimir Putin being prepared to accept anything that Donald Trump may put on the table? Because if you hear some of the things that have been mooted by those around Trump in recent weeks, things like a demilitarized zone, this seems like a long way away from what Vladimir Putin would be prepared to accept. And it seems from afar to me almost as if Zelensky is more prepared to talk peace than Putin is. So how do you see that playing out in the new year?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things there. We can come on to the Zelensky element in a moment. It's very hard to tell. I mean, look, for me, common sense would be this is probably, not quite, but close to the high point of Russian operations. And you really want to make a peace when you're at your strongest, rather than when you're in decline. So common sense, for all kind of reasons, should be that Putin should basically enjoy the fact that he's controlling about 19% of Ukraine, that he can claim to have held off not just Ukraine, but the entire Western alliance. And also, look, let's be honest, both his population and most of his elite, frankly, would like peace. However, what seems common sense to me may well not be common sense to Vladimir Vladimirovich. And at the moment, he's certainly sounding very cocky. And it's hard to tell if that's just a very hard-nosed negotiation tactic, which is classically Russian. You start with a ridiculously ambitious series of demands that you try and present as being the irreducible minimum, because you know you're going to be haggled down. So it might be that. And certainly there are signs of the presidential administration preparing governors in particular to have some kind of narrative as to why peace now makes sense. However, I'm not convinced that peace, as opposed to a ceasefire, is really conceivable. I think it's a lot easier for Donald Trump to actually impose a ceasefire and basically say, just stop shooting. And if the Russians don't agree, then I will increase the amount of aid going to Kyiv. And if the Ukrainians don't agree, then I will decrease it. A ceasefire, though, is not a lasting peace. And in some ways, what that would do would give the initiative to Vladimir Putin, because he can then regroup his forces and then decide, and it could be a week later, a month later, or a year later, or never, to restart the actual war. Now, the Western hope would be that a ceasefire provides the basis for then peace negotiations. And I don't think Putin would say no to peace negotiations. But look, he's certainly not a good faith actor. He could well just simply think, well, I'm going to let these peace negotiations just roll on and make sure that my negotiators follow down every single potential rabbit hole to drag this out until the West loses interest and the Ukrainians just basically give up. So, it could be a sort of an eternal negotiation, which essentially leaves Putin in control of, as I say, almost a fifth of Ukraine. So, that's, I think, the situation. And when we come to Zelensky, I think he's clearly very aware of the risk. And a lot of his discussion, he said he often moots things and then withdraws them. He said that maybe he could give up thought of military reconquest of the occupied territories in return for rapid NATO entry and various other things. At the moment, in some ways, what Zelensky is doing, he's negotiating implicitly with the West. He's saying, look, if you want a peace, if you want us to stop fighting, we need some kind of serious security guarantees. What are you prepared to offer us? Because this is the trouble. At the moment, from Ukraine's point of view, there's some thought of NATO membership at some unspecified future point. Ukrainians know full well that most NATO members don't actually want Ukraine as a member. That no one's willing to admit it openly, but it's a pretty clear sort of situation. And that other kind of security guarantees may well not have anything like the weight of NATO's Article 5. So essentially, this is what he's saying. If you expect us to make a deal, tell us also how you're going to secure us. And that is at the moment another one of the key obstacles before any kind of real peace.
Obviously, Vladimir Putin, well, I say obviously, you would assume Vladimir Putin would have been happy with the results of the US presidential election, that he would see Donald Trump as someone who he can do business with in a better way than Joe Biden or indeed Kamala Harris. But what do you think the current state of their relationship is? And what explains, for example, the decision to show naked footage of Melania Trump on Russian TV? If they are trying to win over Donald Trump, is that not just completely counterintuitive?
It is, but let's be honest. First of all, we mustn't forget that not everything that happens on Russian media has been sort of carefully determined by the Kremlin. Sometimes people think that they're doing what the Kremlin would like. And secondly, let's not forget the Russians can be as stupid as the rest of us. Because I must admit, I have no good explanation for that. People have constructed all kinds of theories of it's attempted blackmail or something like that. None of it really at the moment convinces, but as I said, I don't have an alternative answer. But I do think it speaks to an interesting ambiguity. You're absolutely right that from the Russians' point of view, they would much rather Trump to win the elections, and they were happy that he did. But on the other hand, there is also a caution. It's quite interesting if one looks at the messaging that absolutely clearly is coming from the Kremlin to the Russians themselves. It's very much trying to damp down expectations. Don't assume too much. And even the suggestion has been made, firstly, by Nikolai Patrushev, who is essentially the former sort of, in effect, national security advisor to Putin, still a close Putin aide, and a man who actually is so hawkish as to make Putin sometimes look vaguely liberal. But then Putin himself suggesting that actually if Donald Trump veers too far away from the agenda of the American deep state, then he faces another assassination attempt. Now, that's nonsense. But nonetheless, again, it's nonsense that's really aimed as much as anything else to the Russians to say, look, don't think that everything's going to be suddenly wonderful. Because they know that Trump is very unpredictable, Trump is very touchy, and that he's also someone who, if he feels that he's being treated as a loser, this is probably his sort of greatest pathological fear, that actually he could respond very badly. I mean, they do remember, for example, the point where, quite literally over the course of a few hours, Trump, when he was president first time, decided to launch cruise missiles against Syria in response to a chemical weapons attack. This is a man who has a much lower threshold for the use of violence than Biden certainly did, and who also can literally change his mind overnight. So I think from their point of view, yes, they are looking forward, shall we say, to the Trump presidency. They're hoping they can get some kind of a deal on Ukraine because it fits both their and Trump's predilections, this idea of the great powers determining the fate of the world. Of course, Kiev might actually have other views, but at the very least, they are looking forward to what happens in terms of disruption within the Western alliance as regards Trump's policies, particularly if, let's say, we have a trade war with Europe or something similar. From their point of view, disruption is almost as good as agreement.
And do you think Putin is aware of that? Do you think he recognizes the fact that, what he shares with Donald Trump is a desire instinctively to be the big man in the room, but that if he wants to keep Donald Trump on side, he can't allow people to construe whatever deal may or may not be struck as somehow Trump giving in to Putin or being Putin's lapdog? Is Putin aware of that? And would he be comfortable almost allowing him to be seen as compromising with Trump?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think and the unsatisfying answer I'm going to give is yes and no. What Putin is clearly very good at is understanding and interacting with other, shall I say, self-defined strong men. Whether we're talking about Xi or Erdogan in Turkey or Viktor Orban in Hungary or indeed Donald Trump, actually, Putin is able to kind of connect with them and think at the same kind of level as them. On the other hand, what Putin, and indeed maybe Trump, clearly doesn't understand is democratic polities. And I think this interaction between the actions of the individual man and the political context in which he operates is something that has, frankly, tripped Putin up in the past and may well again. Again, if Putin really were this cunning political Machiavellian operator, driven by results rather than ego, he would presumably be perfectly willing to, if need be, look like the loser. Look as if Trump had sort of outmaneuvered him if he gets the outcome he wants. And yet, Putin's ego is no less substantial or no less fragile than Trump's. Remember, this is a man who even kept the Pope waiting as a sort of symbolic, I'm more important than you kind of symbol. So, I'm not quite sure. I think, yes, there will come a point where there may well be aspects of the relationship that Putin will be unable or unwilling to swallow. Because when it comes down to it, he doesn't believe that he is less important than the President of the United States, when actually common sense would seem to dictate, regardless of whether you are or aren't, it's worth playing the role of the subservient one.
The Russians were too focused on what's going on in the east. These were their troops equipped with the Western equipment, the M1 Abrams tanks, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the Leopard 2 tanks. There were some British Challenger tanks that were used there as well. You'd have thought that the Russians would have been monitoring those very closely. And this was a good coup for the Ukrainians to be able to get that and put in a separate position, get it trained, get it ready, get the planning going, and then move into Kursk. It's caught the Russians from a strategic and an operational intelligence perspective off guard completely.
It's exposed Russia as weaker than previously thought, and Putin has had to bring in North Korean soldiers, which is obviously a sign of weakness.
It matters to him. It's an embarrassment, and it becomes awkward because the language that Putin has used about peace talks. One of the territorial realities is that Ukraine is occupying half of what it took. I mean, it's lost half of what it took. We have to be aware of that. But it's still the bit it's holding, it seems to be holding quite efficiently at the moment. If that's still the case, it's an embarrassment because something has to be given for the Ukrainian troops to leave the land it's holding.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And for this special edition today, I am joined by a distinguished panel to discuss one of the most stunning events in the Ukraine war this year. It was when Ukraine took the fight to Russia with its incursion into Kursk. With me to take stock is Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. He's one of Britain's leading war historians. Philip Ingram, who during his 26 years in the army rose to the rank of colonel and commanded one military intelligence battalion. And Maxim Tucker, who joins us. He is Ukraine correspondent for The Times and regularly reports from the front line in Ukraine. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline. I just want to start by putting all of this into context when on August the 6th, we got that stunning news that Ukraine had crossed the border and invaded Russia. Your initial reactions, how did you get the news and what did you think first of all? Philip, to you first.
Well, I was at home and my phone had started lighting up from very early in the morning, requesting lots of different interviews, and it's that waking up in bed, opening your eyes, going, "Oh, what's happened now?" And then start to look at the headlines and go, "Ah, that's interesting." Now, if this is more than just a quick in and out, this could be a masterstroke by the Ukrainians.
Lawrence?
Also at home. I mean, I found out on social media and there was a lot of chatter around. And so I was trying to work out what was going on. The first thing I said on the matter was I have no idea what's going on. And I think that's quite an important reaction if you're away from the scene, because a lot of the original takes were quite wrong. They were, as Philip indicated, suggesting this was a raid, a one-off thing, they would be in and out. And it wasn't clear, I think, until a bit in that this was not only something more than that, but that the Ukrainians had made quite significant progress into Kursk. So my initial reaction was I need to know more, and it took a while before I felt I got a grip.
And what about you, Maxim?
I think I was on holiday in Italy at the time, but I was still reading wire copy and saw it happening. And I remember being quite jealous of the correspondent who was in Ukraine at the time, because it was obviously a huge moment and something the Ukrainians were very proud and very excited about. And it changed the atmosphere and mood amongst Ukrainian troops that I was talking to at that moment. They were very excited to be taking the war to Russian territory. And so to have been on the ground at that moment, I think would have been quite special, quite something.
15,000 troops invaded Kursk. It took around 1,000 square kilometres in a week. Lawrence, can you remind us who did it and how they did it?
Well, they did it in a rather straightforward way. They gathered. The Russians knew that they were gathering, but there's a sort of element of disbelief on the Russian side. So when you have something like this happening, it takes two to make a surprise attack. And it was the Russians who allowed themselves to be surprised. So they got through some rather thin defences, but defences that were there. And again, there's questions about the extent to which the resources which had been devoted to the defence of the border had been spent wisely by the Russians. But troops just moved through. And they had a clear plan about where they were going, and they took advantage of surprise. But the interesting question is still why the Russians allowed themselves to be surprised.
Exactly, and I'll put that to Philip, because your military service in Iraq in 2005, you were the most senior British intelligence officer in Western Iraq, job to predict and disrupt enemy attacks. Why didn't the Russians see this coming?
It's always difficult having 2020 foresight.
Yeah.
It's always easy to criticise 2020 hindsight. The Russians were too focused on what's going on in the east. They had not monitored or not seen the Ukrainians moving their troops around into position. which shows that they haven't got the level of intelligence coverage over Ukraine that they think they had. And the troops that the Ukrainians were using, they used their 1st Brigade, they used the 47th Brigade, they used their 225th Separate Assault Regiment. These are some of their best troops. These were their troops equipped with the Western equipment, the M1 Abrams tanks, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the Leopard 2 tanks. There were some British Challenger tanks that were used there as well. You'd have thought that the Russians would have been monitoring those very closely. And this was a good coup for the Ukrainians to be able to get that and put in a separate position, get it trained, get it ready, get the planning going, and then move into Kursk. It's caught the Russians from a strategic and an operational intelligence perspective off guard completely. And that's allowed the Ukrainians then to begin to understand the level of coverage they've got and exploit that in some of the more recent operations that we're seeing.
And Maxim, you've been reporting from the other side of the border before the Kursk offensive, from Sumy, Kharkiv, Lipsy, where the Russians have been really trying to make ruthless advances. Can you just paint a picture of the context, what you saw at the time and what was going on?
Well, I think one of the things that the Ukrainians realized faster than the Russians, and maybe have been a bit more adept at utilizing, is the use of drones, and particularly first-person view drones, and different ways of adapting commercial drones for lethal effect. And that was something that, we saw them doing in Kharkiv in a defensive mode, and then they used that in Kursk very effectively. They gathered a lot of FPV drone operators to support that operation. They used different frequencies that the Russians weren't jamming, weren't aware that the Ukrainians would use. And they very effectively deployed their own electronic warfare equipment to suppress Russian drones. So drones are so critically important to this war. Eyes in the sky give you a huge advantage on the battlefield. And if you're also able to use your drones effectively as artillery, but very, very focused, very targeted, you're able to kind of punch holes in Russian defenses. And the Russians weren't prepared for that at all. They had kind of conscript soldiers along the border. They didn't have good electronic warfare systems there, and they weren't ready for the kind of modern warfare that has already been fought in other part of the sector, other sectors on the front.
And Lawrence, what was the political context at the time?
Well, it was one that was very difficult for Ukraine. Just go back on one point, it's worth keeping in mind. The Russians had had their own cross-border movement from Kharkiv not long before, which actually was not that successful. It looked more impressive than it was. But that reinforced the idea that Ukraine was on the defensive at all points. So it had been a really difficult 6 months or so for Ukraine, longer. After their offensive had petered out in late 23, the Russians had moved on to their own offensive. And important, they've been at it ever since. They're over a year now. The Russians have been pushing and pushing and pushing. And then you have the problem with Congress not authorizing the supplemental, which would give Ukraine more military support. So there were real problems of being outmanned, outgunned in the battles in the east. And it just looked like the initiative was completely moving to Russia. So I think from Zelensky's point of view, from the Ukrainian command point of view, given that it was going to be difficult to take the offensive inside Ukraine itself, this was seen as a means of at least showing that they could take initiatives. And at the time, there were a variety of objectives put forward, one of them being to increase what they call the exchange fund, basically take a lot of prisoners so they could exchange them for Ukrainian prisoners. But they hoped, and this I think has been one of the major questions that still lingers, they hoped that this would divert effort from the east to relieve some of the pressure there, because they assumed that Russia would not be very happy with some of its own territory being occupied.
And Philip, what kind of warning would Ukraine have given its NATO allies about their intentions, and would NATO have been involved in the planning?
NATO itself per se, no, because NATO leaks like a sieve. Some NATO members, there will have been information passed, but not complete understanding of the plans to trusted individuals, knowing that those trusted individuals may not necessarily or would not necessarily bring it up to the level of some of their political masters. So formal warning, formal planning, no. Informal relations with trusted individuals, yes. And relations and prior warning to NATO, not in your Nelly.
And Lawrence, you mentioned how until that point, Ukraine have been very much on the defensive, and to make that decision to actually go on the offensive, why would they choose that precise moment? And what kind of factors would the military command have to weigh up before deciding to go on the attack?
Well, it's a gamble. I mean, you'd have to assume that the Russians would not pick it up, would not reinforce. And I think the Russians were aware of the force, but I assume that they think it was going to be defensive. I mean, in case there was another cross-border move into Sumy or from Belgorod. So I think the Ukrainians had to be confident in what they were doing, had to be confident that it wouldn't be leaked before, which is why I don't think they told as few people as possible. They didn't want to be told not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's part of the problem. This very tense, awkward relationship between Washington and Kyiv is partly one where the Ukrainians constantly feel that they're being told how to fight their war without necessarily being given the wherewithal to fight it in any other way. So I think it had to be their initiative, and they had to be confident they could get away with it. As has been indicated, that they got themselves ready for it. It was quite well prepared. It wasn't a spur of the moment decision.
And Maxim, how clever was the offensive?
Oh, it was I think brilliantly planned. I wonder, it was a big gamble because it did take away, as mentioned, some of those kind of elite troops from reinforcing the Donbass, and we see now that Ukraine is struggling in the Donbass, and the very important garrison town of Pokrovsk, which protects the flanks of other important cities in Donbass, is now very vulnerable because of that. And there are Ukrainian troops who are being encircled in Krakow, a small town which, there's urban fighting already going on. So it has been a gamble. I think the Ukrainians felt that there was a big political resonance to this, in that they would show that they were crossing red lines, and they're also very keen to demonstrate to Russia that this war will be carried out on its soil if it continues as well. And you have to look at the other things that have happened in that context. The assassination of this Russian general in Moscow is part of that, demonstrating that this war is coming to Russia. It's not going to be fought only on Ukrainian soil, as well as these kind of increasing amounts of long-range and very effective drone attacks, which are now going very, very far, even one on Grozny the other day. So it's part of an attempt to demonstrate that there will be a cost to continued warfare, that this isn't going to be completely one-sided, and Ukraine is not going to be the only victim in this. But in terms of the strategic importance of the gains, I think, they didn't really take a major city, which doesn't give them that much of a pressure point when they come into negotiations. It's a small area of land compared to the amount of land that Russia has taken and is still pushing to take in Donbass, in the Kharkiv region, and with some troops now massing in Zaporizhia as well. It looks like Putin wants to get the strongest possible hand ahead of any peace talks. So, it may have had political resonance in helping some decisions, like allowing the use of Storm Shadow and ATACMS because the red lines being crossed. It's exposed Russia as weaker than previously thought, and Putin has had to bring in North Korean soldiers, which is obviously a sign of weakness. So those are important things, but they haven't had, I'd say, a very meaningful effect on the battlefield yet.
Philip, in terms of President Putin's response, it was telling, wasn't it? Because he initiated no immediate military counterattack. He was unwilling to divert substantial numbers of troops away from operations in eastern Ukraine. What do you think caused him to react this way, and how do you think what's it shown about his leadership?
Well, he was caught in the hop, so he wasn't prepared for this invasion. It allowed the Ukrainians to wrestle the initiative back again in the overall campaign, because they had tried to get the initiative in August 23 whenever they started their counteroffensive. That stalled and failed, and the Russians were getting the initiative back again and the momentum back again with very, very small advances at huge cost in the east. and Ukraine couldn't defend against that. And therefore, this incursion into Kursk or the invasion into Kursk allowed them to wrestle that initiative back. And I thought that this would dislocate Putin's thinking. It did at an operational level and a strategic level. What he didn't allow it to do, or his military commanders didn't allow it to do, was dislocate his thinking at a tactical level. Because he knew with the force of Ukrainians that were going in that they could only go so far without extending their lines of communication too far and making themselves too vulnerable. And therefore he knew or could calculate what their limit of exploitation would be, and therefore how long he could take to prepare a force to go and try and push them out.
Lawrence, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think that's right. But there were basically, since then, we've had two campaigns going on side by side, one in Donetsk, one in Kursk. And as mentioned, there's other fronts that may open up more. The fact is that even in the summer, Pokrovsk was expected to fall quite soon. So this has been going on for some time, and it may well fall. I mean, it's beleaguered. But the problem for Putin is that every bit of land, even getting land back in Kursk, is taking time and lots of people. And the losses are regularly described as staggering. And so the question arises as to how long this can keep on going. Now, it's gone on longer than a rational leader, one would have thought, would have accepted such losses. And this is put down to Russian history and traditions, and the poor people at the front don't have much choice in the matter. But I don't think one can quite say, as one did earlier, that it has been a complete failure in terms of easing pressure, because they're now putting a lot of people into the battle in Kursk and taking casualties there, as well as not yet having achieved their basic objectives in Donetsk. So the war's at a very interesting stage. And for Putin, I think there's an air of desperation to a degree about how he approaches it. He's had the initiative all year, apart from Kursk, and there's a certain amount to show for it, but far less than I would have anticipated and many others anticipated earlier in the year.
Maxim, how desperately are the Russian forces, alongside the North Korean forces, trying to regain ground, and how fiercely is that battle going on at the moment?
Well, obviously they've got strict orders to take it back, and you see the North Koreans kind of advancing across fields of snow, completely exposed to Ukrainian artillery, and clearly not realizing what kind of war they're fighting. It's kind of First World War stuff out of the trenches over the top, without thinking about the drones in the air above them and the way that artillery fire can be corrected. I think they are suffering from communication problems as well. The Institute for the Study of War has pointed this out, how difficult it must be for the Russians to communicate with the North Korean troops. And there have been some incidents of friendly fire between Chechen and North Korean troops. So I think you can expect to see that continue. I think it is a priority for Putin, but it doesn't seem to be as important for him as continuing to push for the whole of the Donbass. I think, given that narrative that Donbass is Russian, and that the whole war started in 2014 to help the Russian speakers in Donbass, that's still very important to his propaganda. And I think it will be continued to be. I'm also surprised that it's taken so long and that there hasn't been more of a target, a larger force used, as the Ukrainians might have expected it to be, in Kursk to try and drive the Ukrainians out sooner, especially when you're looking at kind of Trump's inauguration and possible peace talks around the corner. Putin will not want the Russians to be still trying to take back their own territory when those peace talks begin.
So Lawrence, not a priority for Putin, Maxim saying, when you put it against the Donbass, but how embarrassing is it for President Putin, given the history of Kursk?
One of the greatest battles of the Second World War. It's an embarrassment.
They've been there a year before, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the battle, haven't they?
Greatest tank battles ever. It's obviously an embarrassment, and like all embarrassments, at first Putin doesn't talk about it and plays it down. then they set deadlines. We assume, I mean, reports come out that there's a deadline of the 1st of October or the end of October, and now 20th of January and Trump's inauguration. But these deadlines are very hard to meet. And the main effect of deadlines on Russian strategy appears to be just to push more people forward into the meat grinder. So it matters to him. It's an embarrassment. And it becomes awkward because, the language that Putin has used about peace talks, which I'm not convinced will necessarily happen that swiftly or easily, but if they do, is to take account of the territorial realities. Well, if one of the territorial realities is that Ukraine is occupying half of what it took, I mean, it's lost half of what it took, we have to be aware of that, but it's still, the bit it's holding, it seems to be holding quite efficiently at the moment. If that's still the case, it's an embarrassment because something has to be given for the Ukrainian troops to leave the land it's holding.
And in that light, Philip, how important is it as the year comes to an end that Ukraine manages to hold on to at least some territory in Russia?
I think it's important because it continues to reinforce the message that to Putin and to those international supporters of Putin that he hasn't got control of the situation in the battle space. And I use battle space because it's not the tactical front line. It's operations at the operational level and the strategic level. This conflict is not going to be won or lost by who takes or regains most territory in the east of Ukraine. It's going to be won or lost by dislocating one or other side's ability to prosecute and continue to prosecute warfare at the operational level, and then the strategic level interactions that are happening. And that's why we're seeing the Russians still focusing on the tactical side. The Ukrainians are holding the Russians as much as they can, trading some territory for time, but they're using that time wisely to attack into this operational level. Kursk getting in, the attack on the Russian general in the last few days, the drone attacks as we've heard about, and all the rest of it, and that will have the strategic level implications whenever Trump comes in that we can't predict at the moment.
And Maxim, can you explain a little bit more about the way the Kursk offensive has enabled the Ukrainians to extend the reach of their operations?
Well, I mean, it's been important in that the North Koreans are part of this war now, and that has triggered the US and the UK into allowing the use of long-range weapons like ATACMS and Storm Shadow on Russian territory. Now, it seems that they're still limited to the Kursk region, but that obviously is important. I think the long-range attacks that are launched against Russia are launched from other places in Ukraine. They are launched from many different sites and they keep moving around. So it doesn't necessarily help with that. I think it's more about the kind of political salience of having troops on Russian territory than it does to kind of strike deep into Russia. The Ukrainians have got other means of doing that, and they're developing them. And, they're now talking about a ballistic missile program, and they expect to have ballistic missiles ready and available to them within 6 months. Zelensky's talking about having 3,000 of those. That will start to bring some kind of strategic parity to Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, Russia's still got an enormous arsenal that Ukraine can't compete with, but Ukraine will have the ability to at least inflict pain suddenly and dramatically on different areas of Russia, and that's important.
Lawrence, we spoke earlier, or Philip was saying about how ahead of this in the initial incursion that the Ukrainians would not have wanted to ask permission to do it. And we since, as Maxim talked about, the assassination of the general in Moscow, how much further do you think Ukraine is going to go in terms of deciding itself and saying, you talked about the relationship with Washington, it's kind of an easy relationship. How do you see that developing and building on this growing confidence, if nothing else?
Yes, I mean, we have to be careful about their growing confidence. They've had a hell of a battering this year, and they've got to get through the winter.
To make their own decisions.
But they have the Ukrainians have got three basic issues that they're trying to address. One is coping with attacks on their infrastructure, which requires air defences and just getting through the winter. But they're stuck with that. I mean, it'll be a grim winter, but they have to get through because they haven't got a choice. Secondly, mobilization, getting people to the front, and some real command and control issues that they've had. There have been moves recently to try to improve matters, bring in some fresh thinking into the command system, but that's a problem. And then third, the most successful bit of what they've been doing has been the development of long-range strikes using their own drones, Maxim said, against a range of targets which are military more than sort of the critical infrastructure. I mean, they've attacked oil refineries and so on, but they've attacked air bases, fuel dumps, ammunition dumps, and so on, with some success that you can start to see in the front lines now. The ability of Russia to direct fire in Ukraine's direction is still substantial, but not as great as before. Meanwhile, slowly but surely, production is coming in from Europeans and the Americans, and then you've got Trump. And so in terms of the Ukrainians feeling sure about their initiative and so on, they've got a big uncertainty coming up, which is not only the questions of negotiations and are they going to have their arms twisted to agree to things they don't want to agree to, but also will the Pentagon be turning the taps on in the way that they've been turned more or less on. I mean, not as easily as the Ukrainians would often like over the last few years. So that is the main uncertainty. They'll keep their own counsel about how they're going to do things until they've got much more confidence in the incoming administration that whatever they tell them isn't going to be used against them.
Mm. Just over 3 months since the invasion of Russia by Ukraine, it is still too early to assess what the long-term impact will be. If I could put this to all of you at this stage, I mean, does it look like the decision to invade was the right one, Philip?
I think, yes, it was the right one because it gave Ukraine the initiative back. It put that morale boost amongst the Ukrainian troops and the Ukrainian population as well. And it brought the war to the Russian people in a way that it hadn't done beforehand. What surprised me was Ukraine didn't use this as phase one of multiple phases of operations to retain that initiative. Maybe what we're seeing in the deep battle with the drones attacking oil refineries and generals being killed in Moscow and elsewhere is that phase two and phase three. It wasn't at the momentum level that I was hoping it would be, but yes, it was the right decision.
Maxim.
Yeah, I totally agree with that assessment. I think it gave a huge morale boost. That was really important at a time when Ukraine felt that it was being abandoned and it was on the back foot, and it demonstrated to Russians that this was a war that would increasingly be fought on their territory, and I think that was very important. But at the same time, it hasn't led to the more strategic gains on the battlefield, and there hasn't been a concerted, operational pace to keep that momentum going. And that's been surprising, and losing some of the territory that they'd lost in Kursk, which was quite easy to defend, and failing to cut the Russians off, who were stuck on the wrong side of the river. It was also, I think, slightly disappointing, but I think it was a good gamble to make given the situation they were in.
Yeah, I don't think this was ever going to be decisive, and it illustrates a problem that the Ukrainians have, and for that matter, the Russians have had, which is just offensives are really very difficult in this day and age. You may have a window that allows you to move without the enemy without the enemy having much time to respond. But everything's so visible. It's very hard to move. And the Ukrainians have had a number of offensives, including Kharkiv in 2022, where they found it very difficult to follow up initial success. They just, it's both difficult and they don't quite have the resources to do so, which is why I think the Ukrainian effort is to make things as difficult and as uncomfortable for Putin rather than just concentrate on territory per se. Because it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for them just to retake territory. They've got to create a situation in which Putin, for one reason or another, needs to cut his losses.
What has the whole Kursk offensive shown about Ukraine's ability to go on the attack, to go on the offensive?
Well, the Kursk offensive and their counteroffensive that started in 2023 has shown that Ukraine doesn't have the capability, the military capability, to punch through the Russian defences in a regular way. They don't have the armoured engineer capability to get through the very comprehensive Suvorikhan defence lines out of there. And what they don't have is the Air Force capability to create local air superiority over the area that they're punching through, leaving the ground forces very vulnerable indeed. They'd clearly identified in Kursk there was less of a Russian air threat, an air defence threat, so they could create that, allow them to get and exploit the area that they did. But that's why the Ukrainians are not in a position to win from a tactical perspective until they get an awful lot more Air Force equipment.
I mean, I agree with that. I think there's a problem of command and control. They're not that good above the sort of the company level almost. And this is the big lesson, I think, that came from the summer of 2023, when they're far too optimistic about what could be done, and the Russians could see them coming and they were prepared for them. Even then, they did at one point look close to a breakthrough, but it never quite came. And they reverted back to trying to follow less Western models of offensives, to doing what they thought they did best, which is small-scale operations, which is easier to do, but it doesn't take you necessarily very far. And one of the things I think to watch over the coming year will be whether they both develop not only the kit and the drones now taking over from aircraft, but also the command capacity to manage larger scale operations.
And Maxim, you've been with the soldiers on the ground. What have you learned about their ability to go on the offensive?
Well, I think, not to exaggerate it, because of course air power is so vital, but some of the brigades that I've been speaking to and the special forces units who have already switched to NATO operating procedures and NATO command structures, where you'd have a brigade commander that war games with his planning officers, that it encourages more junior officers in the staff to provide alternative options, to interrogate some orders before they're kind of passed down the chain of command, and to make sure that they are ready for different eventualities and not having kind of initial success or plan B, plan C, plan D. That seems to have been something that those brigades really like. So at the very least, that is a big motivating factor for those that have already implemented that system. And it would make sense that it would avoid the kind of problems that you have in the Russian army, where you get an order and you just have to go and fulfill it, and there is no real, maybe we should do it this way, maybe we could do it that way, this might be more effective. Those discussions aren't had in the Russian army, and you can see the effects of that in some of the battles. And that's still, unfortunately, the case in many Ukrainian units. And of course, there are those in war that kind of abuse authority and abuse power as well. And there's still a problem with corruption. And there's still a problem with corruption within the military in some units. And the NATO structure seems to be better at dealing with that and preventing it. Russia is not this kind of all-powerful entity that Putin likes to portray it as. They have suffered serious casualties. They've lost a huge amount of equipment in Ukraine, and they weren't able to support Syria, and they certainly weren't able to support Assad in the short term kind of rapid reaction force. They didn't have enough assets in theatre to prevent what was happening very rapidly. And there is also a Ukrainian footprint in Syria. There have been Ukrainian special forces working with some of the rebel groups because they're determined to kill the Russians wherever they are. And they've been training using drones, and we'd seen footage of Ukrainian special forces there previously. So I think the Ukrainians will welcome this as, it's a sign that Putin's regime is creaking. It doesn't have this global reach.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're taking a look back at 2024 and asking whether it's been a good year or a bad year for Volodymyr Zelensky. Joining me to discuss that is the Times' Maxim Tucker, who's been reporting on the war in Ukraine throughout the war. Maxim, always a pleasure. Welcome to Frontline. Let's start with that big question. 2024, looking back, Good year, bad year for Zelensky, or somewhere in between?
I think it's been a difficult year for Zelensky. We've seen the optimism of last year gradually start to fade away. This realization that despite the enormous casualties that Ukraine has been able to inflict on the Russian forces, that Russia is still going and still creeping forward, and it's still using many of the same kind of trite and advanced tactics they were using this time last year. And Ukraine, despite having almost all the armaments now that it's been asking for, and the ability to use them in the way that it wants to, is still not able to hold the Russians at bay. And that's a largely because of the delays in providing that ammunition and armaments, and the restrictions on Ukraine using them, that have caused Ukraine also to suffer a lot more casualties than it needed to, and Ukraine now really running low on manpower. In other regards, politically, it's been quite a good year for Zelensky because he's been able to consolidate his power inside the government. He's dismissed a lot of cabinet ministers and replaced them with people that are loyal to his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak. And he's got more power, I'd say, than perhaps any president since independence in Ukraine. But at the same time, that has caused some people some consternation within Ukraine. People are talking about the fact that corruption is still not being addressed sufficiently. There are more allegations of corruption than before, and people are starting to talk about, what about a reset? If there is a ceasefire agreement, are we going to have some kind of elections in Ukraine as part of that? Because Zelensky is now over his mandate, and the people around him are obviously exhausted, but determined to hang on to power at the same time.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, if there were elections, say in 2025 in Ukraine, do you think Zelensky would win?
It depends who he's running against. So at the moment, the most popular political figure in Ukraine is General Zaluzhny, who has been removed probably because of that reason and placed as the ambassador to the United Kingdom. But he tells his team pretty much every week, because there are questions about it, I'm not interested in running for government office. It's not what I want to do. I'm not a politician. There are signs that one of the Klitschko brothers may be running for presidential office. And there's been some rumors that it may not be actually Vitaly, who's already the mayor of Kiev, but his younger brother Vladimir, who has recently called out Joe Rogan for making some inaccurate claims about Ukraine, and is beginning to burnish his profile as perhaps a political figure. He's been in Ukraine recently. I saw him on my last trip to Ukraine discussing with what looked like a large team of strategists in a hotel. So people are already thinking about what comes next after Zelensky, and people are talking about it within political circles inside Ukraine.
It's interesting you mentioned General Zaluzhny. Obviously, Zelensky took the decision towards the front end of the year to replace Zaluzhny as Ukraine's military commander-in-chief with General Siersky. How significant a moment was that, and did that lead to any notable change in tactics on the front line?
I think it was a significant moment in that it came to a head some of this frustration, perhaps, with this political rule and the lack of changes under Zelensky's administration, and there's still constant rumblings of corruption despite the big war effort that they need to focus on. And it was seen as another example of Zelensky being worried about somebody being influential and powerful within the Ukrainian government and not necessarily being a sycophant for Zelensky, not necessarily always agreeing with him, being a kind of person that's willing to present a less than rosy picture. And that came to a head with this Economist article where Zaluzhny set out his idea that the war in Ukraine had become a stalemate, which is something Zelensky didn't want to see. And Zaluzhny saying these are the kind of technological advances we will need in order to have victory. And that kind of profile, I think Zelensky and his team, particularly the head of his presidential office, Yermak, were unhappy to see. And we've seen ministers who become popular, like Kubarakov in the Ministry of Infrastructure, have been dismissed because they become influential and popular and have had good relationships with Western partners. And that's seen as something that Andriy Yermak wants to suppress and make sure that everyone is speaking through him to the president. And that's increasingly, that was the Zaluzhny example was the clearest example of that. But that's become more and more apparent throughout the year, this consolidation of control in the hands of the presidential office, and much less power in the cabinet ministers, and any kind of influential or effective character being removed in order to make way for someone who's loyal to Zelensky.
You mentioned the delay in Western military aid, in particular the huge package of military aid that was stalled in US Congress. I mean, we were talking about this time last year and discussing when it might be approved, and the hope was it would be approved very early in 2024. I don't think it ended up getting approved until the spring, and that was a very significant delay. In retrospect, how much damage did that do to the Ukrainian war effort, that delay, that uncertainty?
I think it's cost Ukraine a lot of lives. And if all of the things Ukraine had been asking for had been delivered at the moments that Ukraine was asking for them, then Ukraine had a real chance last year with its counteroffensive of taking back some ground and, really inflicting a heavy punch to the Russians. Now, the delays for months and months since over the negotiations of that package, just to put Ukraine on the back foot, there were forces who were running out of ammunition, limiting their usage of mortar shells to a handful a day, not striking Russians when they saw them advancing, only, having criteria if there has to be 10 Russians in this area before we start hitting them. And that obviously allows the Russians to make creeping gains. Now, there is more ammunition coming to the front, but it is not being distributed evenly. And obviously, with the uncertainty that Trump's inauguration will bring, the Ukrainians are having to ration some of that ammunition still because they're not sure what they'll get afterwards. So they don't know how long the war is going to last. It's only sensible to make sure you keep back some of your supplies. But the inevitable result of that is that you take more casualties, that you're less able to stop the Russians advancing in certain areas. And they're still suffering problems as a result of that. And, we've seen even with these kind of very significant shifts in US and UK policy to provide ATACMS missiles to allow Storm Shadows to hit inside the Kursk region on Russian soil, and the provision of F-16s, these are still coming through in very small numbers, and it's still not enough to make a significant change to the battlefield. And that's very frustrating for Ukrainians because they feel that at one point they really could have won this war if they'd had all the help that they'd asked for, and now it's slipping away from them.
You mentioned Kursk there. Of course, one of the biggest moments in the war in 2024 was the decision by Ukraine to launch an incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. How consequential do you think that was? Is it still too early to judge? And what impact have we seen so far?
I think the Ukrainians were hoping for the shock value that would bring home to the Russian population, and that people would see that Russian borders were not secure and this war is really going to have an adverse effect on them, and maybe that would bring them to the peace table. And I think a secondary objective is obviously having some kind of territory which you can swap back as part of any ceasefire negotiations. But they haven't done very well to hold on to. About a third of the territory has been lost. They didn't get as far as they might have hoped to